Lakshmi has something really important to say. She has many amazing things in this text, but one thing she says, always remember that when I first manifested myself in perceptible form, I deliberately chose to appear in a female body. Therefore, a person devoted to spiritual practice should never, ever abuse a woman, not physically, not verbally, not even in thought. Anyone who disdains women disdains me.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Sabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. We've got a great show in store for today. We're going to talk all about the goddess traditions, in particular, the goddess traditions of South India. Here to talk with us today about these traditions is Linda Johnsen. She's a longtime student of religious philosophy. She holds degrees in Eastern and Western psychology and has postgraduate training in theology and Sanskrit. She's the award-winning author of 8 books on spirituality, including Daughters of the Goddess, The Women Saints of India, The Living Goddess, Reclaiming the Traditions of the Mother of the Universe, as well as Lost Masters, which is a book that we talked about on episode 71 of the Savannah Podcast. So if you haven't listened to that yet, go ahead and listen to that one after you hear our chat today. Linda, really happy to have you back on the show.
Thrilled to be here, Ashton.
So in your book, you talk about both an experience you had when you were 14, as well as some experiences that you had at a Kali temple in Calcutta. Can you give our listeners a brief story of your background and as well kind of what got you so connected to the goddess traditions?
Yeah, well, there's lots of information about Greek and Roman goddesses or Norse and Egyptian goddesses, and like even Near Eastern goddesses like Inanna or Ishtar. But the goddess tradition in India is the only goddess tradition that's still alive. And it's been practiced on a massive scale since at least Paleolithic times. And most important, unlike the other goddess traditions, the esoteric component, the inner life of the tradition in India, it was never lost. Remember, Sanskrit is related to English, and many of the ancient Vedic gods of India are related to our own pre-Christian deities, those of us of European extraction. So it's entirely possible that by studying the Indian tradition, we may be able to recover some of the hidden dimensions of our own Western goddess faith, which was completely obliterated over the last 2,000 years. And I've always been fascinated with Hinduism, and I was incredibly fortunate to study it in depth in graduate school. So I just wanted to say, because this information doesn't come from me, it comes from my teachers. They were these incredibly brilliant pundits and yogis and swamis from India. And one day, one of my professors, Dr. Tiganite, invited me into his home, where I met his family and saw how he worshipped in his home shrine. It turned out that he was a Shakta, a devotee of the Divine Mother. In fact, it turns out that almost all my teachers from India were Shaktas. And I thought of them as these like genius intellects. But in their private lives, they were passionate devotees of the goddess. It turns out that there's this yogic mystical side to the goddess tradition that I had no idea existed. So I actually assisted Dr. Tiganite in translating several of the Shakta scriptures into English. And the material that we were looking at completely blew my mind. The goddess tradition is nothing like I learned about, in my anthropology course in college. It was vastly, vastly more sophisticated and amazing. So I wound up actually getting initiated in the tradition and writing my master's thesis on Shaktism. Ashley, have you been to India?
I have, yes. I've spent collectively over a couple trips about a year in India. And I had a very similar experience of when I was exposed to the goddess traditions. It just completely reshaped my concept of reality, and based on all the other past spiritual disciplines and philosophies that I had encountered up to that point, which were very, what I would say is the vertical paths. They were all looking to get you up and out and away from the challenges of life. Here was the goddess tradition that said, nope, here it is, here and now. What are you going to do about it? And it just completely blew my mind in all kinds of amazing, wonderful ways, and still blows my mind to this moment.
Yeah, it's like it's not what you expect at all. If you've been to anyone listening to this, if you've been to India, you know that there are images of the Divine Mother literally everywhere. You see her in food stores and sari shops and painted on sides of trucks and in banks because she gives prosperity, and in homes and temples throughout the subcontinent. But the point is that she's a real living force everywhere in India. When we have the Goddess Festival here in California, where I live, maybe 30 people will show up, and 29 of them will be women. But when there's a Goddess Festival in India, 600 million men and women are out in the streets or in the temples chanting, Jai Shri Sadatni Ma, victory to the Eternal Mother. I mean, you probably saw that, Indian Navaratri or Saraswati Visarjana. Those are real goddess festivals.
For our listeners that might be a little less familiar with the goddess traditions, and maybe they've seen a few of the basic main forms of the goddess that are sort of more popular here in the West, can we give them a little bit of the context and placement of where the goddess traditions place everyday reality versus, let's say, or in contrast to say something like Advaita Vedanta, which is viewing the world itself as an illusion, as not real? Where do the goddess traditions, or how do they describe our everyday reality?
Well, if you look at the images of the goddess in India that most people have in their homes or worship in the temples, so you see the goddess Lakshmi, she's showering coins on her devotees, or sometimes she's riding a lion as she charges into battle the demonic forces. Or sometimes she's holding a book or a rosary as she's teaching you to read or to chant sacred mantras. So it's very practical. For the average person in India, the Divine Mother takes care of you. Some of you have probably heard about the great yogi Paramahansa Yogananda. Mm-hmm. And he pointed out that for most people, the mother is closer than their father. So the image of the divine being as mother is especially powerful, especially since the universe gives birth to us and nurtures us and teaches us throughout our lives. So many Hindus see God as mother. But in the West, our concept of the goddess has been strongly influenced by anthropology. And so I have a bone to pick with this. So we're told here the goddess is all about fertility, fertile fields and having babies. And there's some truth to that. But when we ask the goddess herself who she is and what her power is about, here's what she says. I'll read you a very short passage from the Tripura Rahasya. This is a famous goddess scripture from medieval India that I actually helped to translate with Dr. Tiganayat. And here is what the goddess says about herself. I am the intelligence from which the universe emanates and in which it abides. The wise experience me as a true self within themselves. They glimpse me in their own hearts when their minds become as still and clear as an ocean without waves. The supreme wisdom is that which ends the delusion that anything exists apart from myself. The fruit of this realization is fearlessness and the end of sorrow. Now, does that sound like a fertility goddess to you?
Sounds like the goddess of everything.
Yeah, so it's like she's this all-pervading intelligence, this all-pervading power that makes everything happen. Whether that's, helping you find a job, or getting through childbirth safely, or whether it's achieving these extraordinary mystical states in meditation. Whereas kind of like Orthodox yoga, like Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, if any of you have studied yoga in your Yoga Sutras in your yoga classes, it's all about withdrawing inwards, as Ashley was just saying, up, 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 away from the world, retreating from the world into this state just that's completely beyond material reality. But the goddess tradition is about expanding your awareness to embrace all of reality so that you don't run from it fearfully, but you master your experience in the world. You walk as a hero through the world consciously and without fear because you understand the mechanics of how the universe operates. And you understand what your real nature is, which is actually, ever in the lap of the Divine Mother.
Well, and that's such a shift because so many people out there just get caught up in this mindset that like spirituality is something other than our lives. Like you need to go to a special place to practice spirituality. You need to be in India, or you need to be in a temple or a yoga studio, or it's only when you're doing this spiritual stuff. And what the goddess traditions are trying to show is that it's all spiritual. And so it's a matter of allowing us the freedom to navigate that skillfully in our lives instead of just kind of bouncing around scared of everything that life has to offer, because life itself is the goddess and we just have to learn to appreciate her gifts.
Ashley, you're absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. And one way that you even see this in India, like you go to the temples where these rituals are being performed to the Divine Mother, and you've got chickens running around, and you've got naked children running and playing games, and it's part of life. It's not something that's abstracted away from life. It's completely organic. It's an amazing tradition.
Absolutely. Now, one of your favorite stories is the story from the Kena Upanishad. It's a shorter story. I was wondering if you'd be willing to share that story with us about the demigods and Uma.
Oh, okay. The gods, the demigods, the gods, Indra and Vayu and the other deities in India have just won this great battle over the demons. So they're very puffed up and pleased with themselves, especially Indra, who's the king of the gods. But while they're celebrating, they notice on a nearby mountain, there's this shining light. And they're thinking, well, what is that? I don't know what that is. So Indra's the king, so he goes over, so he sends Agni, the god of fire, over to investigate. So Agni goes and he sees this great shining light there, and he asks, who are you? And the light says, well, who are you? And Agni, the god of fire, says, hey, I'm the god of fire. I'm the mightiest force in the universe. I burn the whole universe to ashes at the end of the world cycle. And this shining being holds up this piece of straw to him and says, burn this. And Agni is insulted at this trivial request. And so he directs all his fiery energy at the straw, and he can't even singe it. It doesn't burn. So Agni goes back to Indra. And then they send Vayu, the god of the wind, and Vayu comes, and Vayu demands, this shining being, who are you? And the being says, who are you? And Vayu says, I'm the god of the wind, I'm the great hurricane, I blow away all the ashes of the universe at the end of time. And the shining entity holds up this piece of straw to him and says, well then, blow this away. And Vayu uses all his strength, but he can't move the piece of straw an inch. So then finally Indra comes, but the shining light has disappeared. And it's night now, it's completely dark. And then Indra sees this beautiful golden woman, just shining radiant gold. And he says to her, hey, did you see this shining light, this being of light here before? Do you know who that was? And this golden woman, this is Uma, the great goddess Uma of the Hindu tradition, says that was Brahman. That was the all-pervading reality. And in that moment, Indra gets it. He's enlightened. And what the story is telling us is that the highest reality is something that we find in ourselves, because Indra in the yoga tradition, Pandit Arya told me, Indra represents the masterful self. You know, when you take charge of your karma, when you take charge of yourself and you go in exploring to find the truth in that darkness, when you go beyond forms and images in your mind and just go into that darkness that is your true self. And then this golden woman appears, you know, the golden light of Kundalini. And there comes that flash, that moment of illumination, when you realize that the real issue is not who is that one, but who are you? Who are you? You are that supreme reality. That supreme reality is inside you. And when you know that, then you know the essence of the entire universe. This is a story from the Kena Upanishad. It goes back probably 2,400 years at least. Very, very ancient story. All this wisdom hidden in these ancient myths.
Well, and you share all kinds of stories in your book, The Living Goddess, which, I'm a huge fan of stories. We share. We have plenty of episodes on this podcast that are just sharing stories. So I really appreciated your storytelling in that book. It's interesting, though. So there's a lot of different goddesses. I mean, literally, for as many aspects of reality, there's probably a specific goddess, even within this tradition, for that aspect of reality. But you say in your book that you felt the least in tune with Lakshmi, and I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about Lakshmi and why you feel that you're not as attuned with her as some of the other goddesses.
Lakshmi is all about prosperity and wealth and beauty, and these are important and wonderful things that I have not been very respectful of in my life, because I feel more close to myself to Saraswati. Because my interest has never been in like making a lot of money or wearing lots of cosmetics or things like that. My interest was always in scholarship. At the root of our being, there's a cosmic intelligence filled with bliss. You know, for devotees of Lakshmi, God bless you all, that bliss manifests as prosperity and ease and health and beautiful things. But because this cosmic intelligence is blissful, this universal intelligence is constantly flowing over into our limited human minds in the form of creativity and insight. And this is the goddess Saraswati, the goddess of wisdom and education and the arts, who's been worshipped in India for over 5,000 years. And because of my own particular karmas from past lives, she's the one I'm more drawn to. So for most of my life, I was very, very poor, but very, very happy, because I was sitting at the feet of these great pundits and yogis and yoginis and learning about these esoteric traditions. Incidentally, let me say about Lakshmi, because one of the amazing texts that I studied was the Lakshmi Tantra. And Lakshmi has something really important to say. She has many amazing things in this text, but one thing she says, I'll just briefly quote here. She says, let me find this. Always remember that when I first manifested myself in perceptible form, I deliberately chose to appear in a female body. Therefore, a person devoted to spiritual practice should never, ever abuse a woman, not physically, not verbally, not even in thought. Anyone who disdains women disdains me. And in the Manusmriti, the very ancient Hindu law book, it even says that no country can prosper that doesn't honor women, because women are all, Lakshmis. We really are all manifestations of Lakshmi. Even me, you're a plain little old overweight, scholar. We're manifestations of Lakshmi, and where we go, harmony and peace and prosperity manifest.
Well, and I think what's really appropriate to add into that as well is because I've been a member of a lot of different spiritual communities, and they might pay lip service or play lip service to, honoring the feminine, but it's usually honoring the woman as sort of beautiful goddess, but not honoring the feminine as life energy, emotion. So it's a spiritual community, and okay, we're all elevated over here, and oh, you're having emotions over there. That's unspiritual, and so we get caught up in this sort of patriarchal idea that spirituality is just the transcendent, and all that eminent stuff, all the emotion, all the feelings, that's unspiritual. And I love that the goddess traditions are really getting you or me or just one to look at that and say, no, it is all the goddess. So honoring the feminine isn't just saying like, oh, yes, we honor you, woman. We honor this. It's like, no, it's saying, hey, we honor all of life. We honor all aspects of the feminine and of life. And I know for myself that's always been a challenge because I have an amazing, wonderful wife. She's a very sensitive woman, and so she feels a lot. And to me, it's like, oh gosh darn it, we need to transcend our emotions and feelings, and learning to interact with the goddess has given me so much permission or freedom to enter into that more, and it's completely revolutionized my life. I know my wife has appreciated the goddess traditions of my life because they help me to understand her more and appreciate and accept her more, whereas so much of the spirituality I was given growing up was an avoidance of that type of stuff, which is, I really think the value in the goddess traditions for especially this day and age where we're kind of overrun with patriarchy.
Yes, when I was in graduate school, some of my professors were, pundits and shastris, brilliant intellects. I mean, unbelievably brilliant minds. But then you go in their homes, and it turns out they're filled with emotions. And for me, this was a real revelation because so much bhakti, so much devotion directed at the goddess, and then at everything that the goddess that represents the goddess in the world. I was always really kind of in my head, and my guru Swami Rama Bharati was always trying to get me to focus more on my heart. And it was only after I started spending time with Pandit Tiganath and began to see how he was using his emotion to fuel his spiritual life. He was on fire with love for the divine and all the forms in which the divine manifested in the world. That's the fuel of spiritual life. Let me just mention also, while we're on this topic, that when I was in Trivandrum in southwestern India, I attended the consecration of a new temple, and thousands of people were chanting mantras to the goddess Lalita, which is pronounced Lilita in South India. And that reminded me of the Near Eastern tradition related to Lilith, who was Adam's first wife before Eve in the Jewish tradition. And Lilith refused to submit to Adam, meaning she wanted to be on top of him during sex rather than beneath him. So she's cast out of Eden and forever feared as a vicious demoness. And you put up these magic symbols outside your door to ward her off. Now, if that's Lilith in the Hebrew tradition, in the Hindu tradition, you have Lalita, who's also associated with desire. And she's the wife of the god Shiva. And she insists on being on top of him during sex. She insists that she's independent and cannot be controlled by her husband. So throughout India, you'll see all these beautiful, glorious images of Lalita on top of Shiva while he's staring up at her in ecstasy. And one thing that astonished me is that the mandala for Lalita, called Sri Chakra, which is one of the most sacred yantras in all of Hinduism, looks amazingly like the figure that was used in the Near East to ward off Lilith. So one culture honors the force that the goddess represents, and the other fears it. That's so interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that comes through with so many of, if you look at so many of these spiritual traditions that are more patriarchal, you see that fear of life. You fear the sort of disdain of the experience of living. And I mean, speaking as someone who was going to do the cave thing, and that was where I thought my path was going to be, it's a lot easier. I mean, once you get over the basics of like the familiarity with the comforts of modern living, it's really easy to be on your own doing something, in the sense that you don't have to deal with relationships or people pushing your buttons or all this other sort of unstable stuff. You get to just dwell in that unchanging reality all the time. To me, that's an easy thing. The real challenge in life is staying anchored in that while you're being pushed around by the storms of life. And the goddess traditions are providing a map on how to do that, which is so helpful and beautiful, because it's giving us that opportunity to be more skillful in all the crashing storms. Because the feminine is the weather, right? The weather never stops. It just shifts and changes. So it's not going to be like the whole masculine is like, well, I'm going to get somewhere and it's going to stop. It's going to be done. I don't have to worry about it anymore. But the weather, it might be sunny for a while, but then it's going to storm again, and then it's going to rain, and then it's going to be this. It just is always changing, which is difficult to deal with. But again, that's the beauty of these traditions, to help us with that.
My teacher, Swami Ronald Larkin, he spent 11 months in a cave. I mean, this was completely sealed off, and they would just like slip some food into him every day. For 11 months, he was in the cave meditating, and he said that when he came out, he was almost killed because he couldn't cross the street. He was almost hit by a car because he could no longer even deal with reality. And it was like, well, wait a minute, what good was that?
Yeah.
Although, I mean, he also reached very, very high states of meditation that he mastered. So to go on an occasional retreat like that, I mean, it has something to say for it. But you still need to be able to deal with reality.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Saraswati as being a goddess that you very much connected with, and I know that you have the story of the Yoga Vashishta in your book. I know it's a rather long story, but I was wondering if you could kind of summarize and kind of give us the juice of that story, or perhaps a different story of Saraswati that you really appreciate it because you connect with her so much.
Well, I guess we only have very little time left, but the Yoga Vashishta is this massive, fantastic, mind-blowing text from India, and in it there's many stories. One is about Leela, who's a queen in northern India, and she has a very happy, fulfilling life, but she worries about when her husband dies. She doesn't want to be alone. She really, really loves her husband. She's really fulfilled in material life. And so she does all the sadhana, all the spiritual practice to the goddess Saraswati. And Saraswati appears to her and begins teaching her about the actual nature of reality and about inner life and external life. Shows her that at the root of everything is actually this living, vibrant consciousness. Saraswati reveals to Leela's previous lives, and so Leela sees how she was engaged with her husband in previous lives, and then Saraswati shows her future lives. There's this one particularly poignant episode in the story where Leela sees that in her next life, the kingdom that she and her husband rules will be destroyed by Surat, this enemy who comes in and is just burning all the houses and killing all the people. And I remember when I read that story, it was one of the most shocking stories that I'd ever read in any Hindu text, because so Leela is just in horror in her subtle body, watching all this death and destruction occurring. And Saraswati turns to her and says, Leela, can you see that this also is the play of consciousness? I was really, really shocked to read that. But in reality, the bad is as much a part of reality as the good. And the Hindus are a lot more sort of honest about the challenging and evil things we see in life. That's also part of life. And if we can recognize, if we can stay centered, in ourselves, and recognize that behind that there's actually a living intelligence, then we can move through that without fear, and with mastery, and even with joy. That was pretty radical to me. I still grapple with that. But it's just, here is life. Here it is in your face. Okay, you're a spiritual person. Now as a spiritual person, deal with that.
Well, and I think what's so great is that you've got the mystical understandings of these traditions because they're still so vibrant and alive in India. Because I see them in a lot of the Western traditions, or Near Eastern, but the ones that have been brought over to the West, like Christianity and Judaism, where, even the original story, you mentioned Adam and Eve earlier, where, they're living in bliss. What gets them out of bliss? Well, they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, meaning the pairs of opposites. They start to compare things as good and bad, and so they suffer. But there's still another tree in that garden, the tree of immortal life, and that brings them back to oneness. That brings them back past duality. And so much of the Indian traditions are speaking precisely to that. Like, we suffer because we start to label things as this and not that. And, I suffer because I'm tall and I'm not short, or I'm this, or I'm this color or that. And so we create all these ideas out of oneness that makes us suffer. It's there in almost all the traditions. It's just more openly spoken about and expressed and explored in Eastern traditions like those in India, which I think is so vital in understanding how we get and interact with life and go through life, immersed in it, instead of trying to constantly run away from it.
If any of the readers would be interested, this book is called The Living Goddess, and a large part of the focus in the book is that there is we usually come from the perspective of our usual conscious mind, but there's also a subconscious mind and an unconscious mind and a superconscious part of the mind. And Shaktism, the goddess tradition in India, deals with all these levels of what we are as a human being, as a soul. And these are parts of ourselves of which there is no understanding in Western science. But all this has been explored really, really exhaustively in these extremely sophisticated traditions in Hinduism, like Shaktism, the goddess tradition, or Shaivism. And this stuff, it will blow your mind. It helps you understand, clairvoyance, telepathy, all this stuff is blown off in the Western tradition. No, when we enter into the very uttermost depths of ourselves, it expands us out into everything else and connects us with everything else. Everything becomes alive and meaningful and full of intelligence and beauty. That's what the goddess tradition is about in India.
Well, and you mentioned your book, and I want to just reiterate for our readers, I really encourage them to go and get the book, The Living Goddess. I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate your style of writing, and I think there's just so much in there for people to get. I mean, you cover all kinds of different topics within the goddess tradition. You get a lot into the Devi Mahatmayam, which is one of my favorite texts on the goddess. You really cover a lot of stories, which I love, so I encourage our readers to get it, because I know that interacting with the goddess traditions has completely changed my views on life. Like, from a fundamental level, it was part of what brought me back into the West, instead of going and just doing the cave thing and living in Asia the rest of my life and kind of hiding from the difficulties of the world. And I really appreciate the work that you've done to bring more and more light to the goddess traditions as well. So thank you so much for that. If you could sort of synthesize or refine one thing for our listeners that you would hope that more people could either integrate in their lives or know about their lives in relation to the goddess, what would that be?
Actually, I'm going to give it a little bit of a twist and mention something I think is really important. In India, it's not like the religion that I grew up in, where you could only imagine God in one way, or else you'd go to hell for eternity. In India, the Divine Mother says in one of her scriptures, it's difficult for people to conceive of me as I actually am, as pure consciousness, intelligence, and power. Therefore, imagine me in any form that appeals to you, and I promise in that very form I will come to you. This was liberating to me to discover this point of view. And this, of course, is why Hindus are not interested in converting you. If you want to imagine divinity as Jesus, that's fine. The divine wisdom is coming to you in that form, too. But the divine is reaching out to us in every way it can, and in every way that we can find that go back to that. Life becomes so rich, so amazing, so like mystical and physical and beautiful and extraordinary when we engage with the living goddess who is the universe and is our own bodies and is our own very awareness.
Well, I love and appreciate that so very much. Where can people find out more about you, the work that you do, your books? Where's the best place to connect with you?
If you want, you can go to my website. It's called lostmasters.com, lostmasters.com. That's after my latest book that just came out, Lost Masters, Rediscovering the Wisdom of the Ancient Greek Philosophers. And it'll tell you about my book, The Living Goddess, Reclaiming the Tradition of the Mother of the Universe, and some of my other books. It's, all this comes from my teachers, and to them I bow again and again. They really shattered my mind and just opened me up to whole new ways of engaging with reality. So to them I bow again and again.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for being on the show, Linda. I really appreciate your work, your insights, and you. So I'm sure that our listeners have learned a lot from this episode and appreciate it, because it's just, you can tell how much you live and breathe and appreciate this stuff as well. It just comes out in the way that you speak. So thank you so much for being on the show today. And for all our listeners out there, thank you for listening. Hope you all have a very present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, it's Ashton here with an announcement. We're starting a weekly contest giveaway over at Savannah Spirit. If you'd like to enter into the contest to win one of our weekly prizes, go to savannahspirit.com/contest. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, we'd really appreciate it if you went over to iTunes, left us a review, leave us some comments, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy it. Also want to invite you to go check out Savannah East, which is the name of our blog and also the name of a Facebook group where I interact with guests and our audience. We'll post recent episodes up there, as well as interesting articles relating to our guests and or the topics on the shows. And again, thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaheast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.